Hi, everyone. My name is Taimur Rashid. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer at Redis. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about the pivotal role of data in being able to accelerate digital innovation and ensuring digital perseverance. I'm really excited to be here. A little bit about me. So I'm the Chief Business Development Officer at Redis. Redis is a privately held company. We are the company behind the most popular open source database called Redis. At the same time, we also have a commercial offering called Redis Enterprise, which we offer as both software, which many of our customers deploy on premise and on the cloud as well too. And then we also have a managed database service, which is available on all the three clouds, AWS, Microsoft Azure, and GCP. And today, I really want to focus on the role of data and how we actually use that towards driving more innovation. And before I do that, I really want to talk a little bit about my role at the company. So I lead emerging businesses for Redis. And part of my role is centered around this constant rediscovery. We have a great technology that developers and organizations use. And when they start using the technology, they sort of rediscover different ways it can be used. And the nice thing about having it being open source is the community itself find these new ways of using the database. And so what started off as an enterprise caching solution, over time, developers look at it and use it for a wide variety of different things, from session management to pub sub type applications, at the same time for machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so it's with that thought that I really want to focus on this thing. And I love this quote from Auguste Rodin, who was a famous French sculptor, and a person that was very foundational in what he did in the art that he built, but at the same time challenging many of the ways that people approached art. And I love this quote from him where he said, "I invent nothing, I rediscover." And this is at the heart of what we do at Redis, which is rediscovering how technology can be used, not only to create new architectures and streamline new approaches for how we actually build software and businesses, but at the same time, rediscovering how the technology can serve the evolving needs of customers. And when you look at sort of what drives change, there's so many external things outside of a person's company that drive change. And when you look at some of these things, and many of you are probably very familiar with these things, from the pandemic, the supply chain shortages, just the overall unpredictability that we experience, particularly even in today's age. There's so many unknowns, and as business leaders, as technology leaders, we are constantly being challenged with all these different things that are happening outside of our companies. What's more important is how we respond to these changes, and having the nimbleness, the agility, and the open-mindedness to be able to respond in these ways. But change, has been happening well before volatility, right? And so, if you take out the impact of the pandemic and what that's caused, not only across business operations, but then the way things are done, change has happened well before that. Right? And you look at the evolution of technology through the different emerging technologies that have come through, and how disruptive technologies have caused us to not only change the way we operate, the way we build processes within our companies, at the same time, the way the technology is adopted by people. We've gone from waterfall development to more agile development, DevOps. At the same time, disruptive technologies like cloud computing and even just mobile technologies. And so a lot of this change has happened, independent of the volatility that's outside a person's company. Look at the Chat GPT phenomenon, which we're actually experiencing today. Chat GPT, built by OpenAI, in just 2 months has hit 100 million plus monthly users. And the rate of change, the rate of adoption, the cycle time is decreasing. And you can see how that compares to some of the existing technologies and applications that we use from TikTok to Instagram. And so you have this phenomenon too, which many business leaders and technology leaders and individuals were figuring out how do we respond to this change. And so in light of those changes that we are experiencing externally and internally, what I really want to focus on is what are those guiding principles that we can kind of anchor ourselves on as we look into the future. And one is really accelerating digital innovation, where we look at a variety of different things to say, how can we actually accelerate the way we build applications, the way we build customer experiences, and respond in a very agile way to the evolving nature of what we see outside. At the same time, as we take those steps, those intentional steps in how we accelerate digital innovation, what do we do as business leaders and technology leaders to ensure that we're also focused on what I like to call digital perseverance, which is being responsible, being very thoughtful about how we actually go about in accelerating that digital innovation so that we can build not only systems and organizations and processes that can outlast us. So what I want to do over the next moments that I have with you is really talk about digital innovation. Now, this is something where organizations have undertaken digital transformation projects. They've invested millions, sometimes billions of dollars into innovating how they evolve themselves as a digital company. And this is a matter of people, process, and technology, and at the core of it being data. And with the vast amounts of data, many of you business leaders are very familiar with the velocity, the volume, and the versatility of the data that's being created within your own organizations. And that across structured and unstructured data, it's so important to understand that a lot of what we're experiencing today requires a different mindset. And when you look at many of the technologies out there, the architectures, we are dealing with a lot of legacy systems. And we've gone through the process where, as we think about how do we modernize our infrastructure so that we can meet the digital needs of the business and customers, we start realizing that there are many siloed aspects of that infrastructure, right? And so it's not a matter of starting a new initiative in a siloed way, although it may start off that way. But over time, what we realize is then you have this disparate technology. You have a lot of stovepiped initiatives that don't connect with anything. And the biggest challenge here with digital innovation is figuring out how do you integrate not only the technology, the processes that are around them, the governance that you have associated with them, and then the people, the organization. We are going through a very interesting evolution in skill sets. The skill sets of 10 years ago now need to be looked at very differently. In fact, when you look at the Chat GPT phenomenon, it is creating this new sets of roles for people. And in accelerating digital innovation, I think it's really important to look at all these three things. But interestingly enough, as we look at digital innovation, one of the things to keep in mind is that applications and the user experience that we actually want to enable for our customers or for consumers really mandates what kind of technology, infrastructure, and therefore the data technology that's required to support it. And what you see here is just an evolution of how we've gone over several decades of relational database systems, SQL systems, NoSQL systems, data that's powering internet applications, ML, and the cloud. What we basically have here is an evolution of data technology, which when we look at the requirements of today's applications, we could almost question, do we have the right data technologies that can support this digital age, right? Now, in every phase of this evolution, we've optimized things in a way where we look at the constraints of the technology today, but we've created innovations to be able to go and address those application needs. And so if earlier in the data technology evolution, the constraints were on spinning disks, and then we had memory, we are looking at applications that now have a very fundamentally different requirement for what that data technology needs to be underneath. I just want to give one example. I mean, when we look at large language models, which, has really caught the industry by storm, they have very different applications. And so when you look at, the value of ChatGPT, for example, in being able to classify, search, generate, summarize, rewrite, and extract, these are very unique and new and emerging capabilities that LLM applications provide. What that causes us to do is to think about data representation very differently. And so if you are keeping up with what's going on in generative AI and LLMs, there is this new representation of data, which, to be honest with you, it's not very new. It's just the applicability of it with these applications is becoming more novel, which is representing data in what we call vector embeddings. And these are numerical, mathematical representations of both structured and unstructured data. And the question here is that what data stores are there that optimize for the storage, indexing, and retrieval of vector embeddings, which are foundational when we look at large language model applications. And so what we actually see here is new architectures as well. So from the data representation, there are new architectures that are being created. And we're working very closely with a number of customers across the enterprise, from pharmaceutical companies to retail companies, in creating these new architectures where now you have a representation of data that's stored in what we call vector databases. And how that plugs into large language model APIs such as OpenAI or Cohere or Stable Diffusion, it's going to be very important. And so the key thing to keep in mind is that applications really influence the underlying data architecture, the data representation, and ultimately how these things start off being very, very emerging, but over time being mainstream. What I want to do next is talk a little bit about some customer examples. And one of the things that I really want to highlight is taking a very first principles approach to modernization. So Capital One of our customers, they have a 100% cloud-based financial institution. They rely a lot on open source. They're the 5th largest payment processor by volume. And one of the interesting things is that as we worked with them, they took a very first principles approach for how do they want to modernize and create this new payment system, this next generation payment system. And rather than starting with, hey, what technology should we use? How should the architecture look like? They really said, well, what's the customer experience that we want to give? And starting with that customer experience and the needs of the customer, working backwards from there, and then ultimately figuring out what are those technology components that need to be part of the new architecture to really meet the customer demand. And so it was really rethinking needs, right? It was really then offering a real-time experience for their customers as they were doing mobile banking and really changing how this payment processing would work. And their head of payments architecture had actually presented at one of our conferences where they talked about this journey. And so one of the key things I really want to highlight here is in this process of trying to accelerate digital innovation, very important to think about a first principles approach. And in this case, being very customer focused, understanding that experience, working backwards from that, and ultimately identifying what technology needs to be there to enable that process. And while you rethink the customer experience, it also helps you sort of reimagine how can you reinvent yourself as a business. And one example that I wanted to give is of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, who happens to be one of an investor within our company. When you think about Goldman Sachs's business, you think about financial services, you think about them helping companies, get listed and go public. But what's very interesting here is how they view themselves. And, they've gone off saying that, we are a technology company. We're building a platform. And innovation is at the heart of Goldman Sachs. And this is an interesting presentation here where 1 out of 4 employees is an engineer. And so in trying to, go after their core business, they've really reimagined how they view themselves, and they view themselves as a technology company. And what you can see here is just by re-looking at how they see themselves as a company, they've been able to accelerate innovation across all their primary business functions. Another good example is Mishu, which is actually a really large social network. They started off as a social network in India. And over time, as they built this amazing social network, they were able to reinvent themselves around social commerce. And they're actually more downloaded than Facebook. And today they have over 2.6 million merchants that are part of their social commerce platform. They're one of our customers as well. And they've adopted these cloud native database technologies to really fuel how not only they give this amazing customer experience to their merchants, but at the same time, how they really innovate and accelerate that innovation as a company, that they can do these big pivots over a short period of time. That goes to my next example, which is Dick's Sporting Good, a big retailer. During the pandemic, it was so interesting to see how they pivoted their business and were able to do that in a very, very agile way. And so, as you can imagine, their primary business was, in-store retail experience. And within a matter of 24 hours, when the pandemic, hit, they really had to kind of reinvent how they were going to serve the needs of customers. And you can imagine, as many people were staying at home, obviously people wanted to work out. They wanted to have access to, gear and things like that, which is Dick's primary business. Within 24 hours, they were basically able to sort of reinvent their process. And many of you are familiar with the contactless pickup process. And in 24 hours, they were able to enable this. And actually, 18 hours after they were able to do that, they had a version 2 of that. And they were able to really pivot the needs here. And, a customer of ours, being able to have a technology like Redis enable them to, have that agility with reinventing that whole process for their customers. And it was really exciting to see them do that. And, a third example here with just how selecting, the right technologies, obviously focusing on first principles, reinventing how you see yourself as a company, but then more importantly, being very responsive to customer needs can really help you accelerate that digital innovation. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that meeting customers where they're at is going to be very, very important. And, one of the things to keep in mind is as these application experiences are evolving to meet the customer demand, you can really see that they're very basic things that customers expect. They expect a real-time experience. They're expecting a personalized experience as well, too. And so, we have this mantra within Redis, which is latency is the new outage. As you're dealing with an application, whether it's a mobile app, a web app, or whatever it may be, when you are not getting the responsiveness to you, that is an outage. One interesting thing here is that one of the users of Redis is a company called Instacart. And there's a thing called item availability, where latency in item availability to a customer's perspective is an outage. And so in trying to meet these new customer requirements, it's really important to realize that people expect it to be instant, real-time, and personalized. What does that fundamentally mean for how we need to build products? And I think this is where it's very important to see what are those roles or those jobs to be done that can really look at data as a product. And, obviously there's a lot more roles here, but I do want to focus on the role of the data analyst, the data engineer, and the data scientist. ultimately, when you look at data as um, that differentiating aspect within your company, how data is treated, how it's managed, and ultimately how it's used to build those product experiences is going to be very important, right? And so the analysis that the data analyst will do, the movement of data across the organization, and the role of the data engineer in making sure that it's streamlined is going to be very important for the data scientist ultimately, who's there looking at the data and saying, how can it be a strategic advantage in products that are being built, consumer experiences that are being realized, but at the same time, how can data be used internally so that it can give the right visibility, give the right insights into evolving business operations and meeting customer demand, right? And as we look at this evolving nature of generative AI and what this means for new roles within a company, there is an emphasis around the prompt engineer, for example, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Ultimately, what we see is when data is at the center, how data is treated is going to influence the jobs to be done on that data. And that's going to create roles. And I think it's very important as for us as business leaders and technology leaders to really understand that in accelerating digital innovation, it's so important to keep data literacy as a core component within the upskilling process for your organization. And then being very specific with what these roles entail and what they ultimately mean in being able to build data products. And this is where, as we look at digital innovation and then accelerating that, it's also very important to think about digital perseverance, right? And this is where we not only look at what we need point in time over the next few months, next few quarters, but it's really about thinking, how do we build systems, organizations, processes, technologies that can outlast us? And this is where I want to emphasize not only the mechanisms of innovation that we create within our organizations, but the emphasis around ensuring cybersecurity, ensuring data privacy. Look, at the end of the day, our responsibility is not only to figure out how to utilize the data in a way where we can accelerate that innovation, but then making sure that we are being very cognizant about the implications of data security and data privacy. And this is where, with more applications and more experiences becoming digital, whether it's our own internal business processes or end user experiences that we enable, the surface area of threat increases. And therefore, cybersecurity is very important for us to think about. How do we think about threat detection? How do we think about, ensuring that anything at the perimeter of our business is fortified with the right security measures? That being said, the third aspect is sustainability. And look, at as much as we have a lot of this innovation that's happening in generative AI and the usage of cloud, it comes with a cost, not only a financial cost, but the decisions that we make as business leaders in how we go about meeting it in the usage of energy, the carbon footprint, the processes that we build around it so that they can be sustainable for our teams and our organization is also going to be very important. And so what I like to emphasize here is, as ambitious as we are as organizational leaders, we also have to be very responsible for the things that we're doing, the trade-offs that we're making. Because ultimately, if we do want to build things that outlast us, we want to build them responsibly and build them in a way where future generations can benefit from it. But at the same time, we make the right decisions right now that can ensure sustainability 10, 20 years from now. And so that's what I really want to emphasize there. And part of what I think is going to be very important in this process is making sure that we are inclusive with how we approach things, not only in how we build teams, but then how we meet the diverse and broad needs of our customers and consumers, right? And so I think that's going to be very important for us over time. My hope is that with whatever I've said today, I hope that it has, at least created some thought process for you all, ignited a little bit of creativity, a little bit of introspection. And the whole thing here is that as we think about change over the course, innovate, accelerating the way we innovate as companies, ensuring digital perseverance, that we create a chain reaction of goodness. And it starts off with, one thing and translates to three things. And then over time, it creates the right chain reaction for us to be able to really influence what the future can look like. And so as those guiding principles I leave with you and these customer examples, I hope that this was beneficial and we can create that great chain reaction to not only reimagine and reinvent the future, but in the process of doing that, rediscover new ways of doing things. And so with that, I thank you all, and I'd love to open it up for questions and answers in the time that we have. I don't see any questions on the chat window here, so maybe I'll wait a little bit and see if anyone wants to ask questions. Okay, great. Well, I know we finished a little bit earlier than time. And so once again, I do want to thank you all for attending. I also want to thank the Data Science Connect team as well for arranging this. I do see one question. Can you define the role of the data analyst? Yes, absolutely. When you look at the traditional role of the data analyst, it is about ensuring that data is visible across the entire organization, right? And so we largely look at this as the role of, kind of business intelligence, where being able to surface data and visualize data in a way where, people across the entire organization, whether they're executives, whether they're, leadership or, frontline workers or, mid-level managers, have access to their representation of data in order to be able to make decisions, right? And I think the role of the data analyst has evolved over the course, right? We've gone from, building reports and dashboards, which, we have this in our organization as well too, where we have all these reports and dashboards, which, maybe 10% of them actually get utilized, right? And so I think the role of data analyst is going to evolve where it is going to be very nimble, very agile, and very focused on making sure that those questions that are most important to the business, depending on the level of inspection, is being met in an agile way, right? And so I do think that the data analyst is going to be very tightly integrated with data engineering and data scientists as well. Can you touch on the main difference between SQL and NoSQL and a use case for the other? Ultimately, when you look at how data stores have evolved, SQL has been a very transactional kind of relational database system, right? And when you look at it, it's powered a lot of the classical front office and back office applications, where generally there is predictability on, the load that can go into that system for the most part. What's interesting in how NoSQL kind of evolved was this explosion with social networks and, these high throughput requirements that a lot of these applications demanded, right? And so this gave rise to a much more flatter data structure with how data is represented. And this ultimately gave rise to the NoSQL databases. And ultimately, when you look at it technically, there are a few trade-offs between, consistency, availability, and what they call partitioning. And so NoSQL gave rise to these really highly scaled applications that didn't have the hard, stringent requirements on data modeling and, kind of relational consistency. And therefore, that's the difference between them. And it does give rise to different applications that can be built. So SQL, very classic for your traditional front office, back office applications, and NoSQL kind of for your high scale, social applications, gaming applications. At the same time, when we look at a lot of these consumer-driven applications that require fast response times, high volume, that's where NoSQL really shines. What small actions have you seen create the largest downstream impacts? This could be in terms of technological adoption, process, and training. Yeah. I think ultimately the applications in the nature of the applications and ultimately how consumers use those applications, what they expect, I think has created the biggest downstream impact, right? In how not only technology is adopted and processes need to be changed, but more importantly, how people need to be upskilled. And we are constantly seeing this evolution of upskilling people around new technologies, right? And so, to the previous question, there was a whole thing around SQL databases, then NoSQL, and the implications of understanding how NoSQL databases need to be utilized. Now we're entering, cloud databases, for example, and what are those architectural considerations that need to be thought of, right? Failover, redundancy, durability are foundational things with these architectures, but they mean different things when you're dealing with a cloud native database versus, a traditional database that's running on premise. Now with vector databases, I mentioned earlier with large language models, that has a whole new way of thinking about upskilling. And I think that's what's created the downstream impact around technology adoption, processes, and training. I see one other question here, and maybe this might be the final question here before we end the session, is when you talk about thinking about a problem we're trying to sort out from first principles, this seems simple, but what if you don't have a tool in hand which can sort a problem? How do you search for it or limit conversations to existing tools? That's a really good question, and I think a large part of it is a bit subjective to the technology background and the background of how a company builds products. I think ultimately those first principles are pretty uniform, and when you look at being very customer driven, starting with the customer, working backwards, I think there are ways you can approach it to kind of really uncover what needs to be done. And then from there, I mean, it is a process of educating yourself on what are the capabilities of the tools, right? Open source tools or commercially available tools and frameworks that can help meet that customer need. I always looked at the 5 whys as being a great principle for how to really understand what needs to be built, right? And that can ultimately get you down to the point where you've identified a set of technologies that could be used for that. And so I hope that was able to address your question. Well, thank you for the opportunity and the questions. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'd be happy to engage in a conversation with you. Once again, thank you so much. I'll end the presentation here and then we'll go on with the rest of the agenda. Have a great day.